When urban violence spikes, the default municipal response is nearly always the same: increased policing, aggressive prosecution, and high-volume incarceration. We treat crime as a moral failure, requiring a punitive reaction. But epidemiological and criminological data tell a completely different story. Violence operates less like a series of isolated criminal decisions and much more like a biological and environmental contagion, spreading through specific structural vulnerabilities and physiological stressors. Local governments actually possess a vast, highly effective, and largely underutilized arsenal of policy levers. By manipulating physical infrastructure, public health, and local zoning, cities can actively engineer safety long before a crime occurs. To evaluate these tools, we map interventions on a matrix, plotting empirical success against implementation cost. A rigorous strategy splits this equation into two goals: separating interventions that reduce the incidence of violence from those reducing its lethality. Relying exclusively on law enforcement to solve this crisis is mathematically inefficient. True prevention requires structurally removing the environmental and biological triggers of aggression. We start with the built environment. The physical architecture of a city dictates the baseline behavioral parameters of its inhabitants, structuring the choices of potential offenders. The presence of blighted, vacant land physically promotes violence by offering weapon concealment and signaling a lack of community guardianship. Remediating these spaces works. A landmark randomized controlled trial in Philadelphia demonstrated that cleaning, grading, and greening vacant lots resulted in a 29% reduction in gun assaults in impoverished neighborhoods. This creates a statistical paradox. While violent crime drops sharply, minor nuisance crimes like disorderly conduct sometimes see a slight increase. The newly green spaces successfully draw community gatherings, which naturally raises the baseline probability of low-level crowd noise. Conversely, municipalities often spend millions on passive surveillance, yet a comprehensive 40-year meta-analysis proves that deploying blanket closed-circuit television in open urban environments yields zero statistically significant effect on spontaneous physical violence. To reduce violence, environmental modification must be active. New York City's tactical deployment of high-intensity street lighting yielded a 36% drop in nighttime outdoor crimes, proving that visibility alone can deter local assault. The mechanism is psychological. Cameras are a post-hoc investigative tool, but bright lighting strips offenders of the anonymity provided by darkness. It actively alters the immediate neurochemical calculus of an altercation by increasing the perceived risk of immediate apprehension. Temperature operates similarly. Epidemiological data confirms a robust correlation between elevated urban heat islands and spikes in reactive aggression. Deploying strategic tree canopy cover and cool roofs directly dampens thermal stress, making climate adaptation a literal crime reduction tool. A city's physical infrastructure is not a neutral backdrop. It is continuously either suppressing or generating violent encounters. Zooming in from the macro environment to human neurobiology reveals invisible physiological stressors. The prefrontal cortex manages executive function and impulse control, and it is highly vulnerable to systemic inflammation. The inhalation of fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, induces massive oxidative stress. Empirical tracking across the United States correlates short-term local spikes in PM 2.5 with objective, measurable increases in spontaneous violent assaults. This biological pathway is most severe with heavy metals. The lead crime hypothesis demonstrates that childhood lead exposure permanently degrades executive function. By lowering impulse control, it essentially hardwires a future propensity for violent criminality in adulthood. Aggressively replacing municipal lead service lines and remediating lead paint functions as a long-horizon public safety strategy, removing a biological driver of future crime. Conversely, certain trace minerals are neuroprotective. Multiple global studies reveal a robust inverse relationship between naturally occurring trace lithium in public water supplies and municipal homicide rates, acting as a population-level mood stabilizer. Diet applies similar pressures. High intake of artificial dietary trans fats severely inhibits omega-3 production, directly triggering irritability and impatience. Implementing municipal bans on trans fats while subsidizing omega-3 availability, which clinical trials show reduces reactive aggression by up to 28%, manipulates behavior at the biochemical level. Violent behavior is rarely an isolated moral choice. It is heavily dictated by a population's baseline exposure to neurotoxins and systemic nutritional deficiencies. Local governments also control the localized concentration of severe violence through their most potent regulatory lever, the zoning and licensing of criminogenic commodities. Restricting the availability of alcohol yields immediate dividends. When Baltimore rolled back late-night tavern operating hours in targeted neighborhoods, the city recorded a 14% drop in violent crime over the first year, achieving this without adding a single police officer. Cannabis follows a completely different logic. Spatial data consistently shows that the presence of legally regulated dispensaries actually reduces neighborhood crime. Because they are highly capitalized, cash-intensive businesses, they deploy extensive lighting and security, creating a guardianship effect that deters motivated offenders from the immediate block. When altering the environment isn't enough, we must shift from reducing incidents to reducing lethality. Local civil courts and police can neutralize the severity of an altercation through extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. Targeting high-risk individuals, specifically through the rigorous enforcement of domestic violence firearm relinquishment, is one of the most statistically proven methods of preventing intimate partner homicide and mass casualty threats. Local zoning boards and civil courts hold as much, if not more, power to prevent lethal violence than criminal court judges. Financial desperation drives instrumental violence, such as robbery, and exacerbates the psychological stress that fuels reactive assaults. Alleviating this requires rapid, targeted liquidity injections. The data reveals an empirical anomaly. Commercial blood plasma donation centers act as a market-based safety net. Their presence drops local crime by up to 12%. They provide immediate, legal cash to desperate individuals, and because payouts require clean drug tests and no recent incarcerations, they heavily incentivize sobriety and law-abiding behavior. For the micropopulation of highly networked, chronic offenders driving the majority of city violence, broad programs fail. Group violence intervention hyper-targets this sub-1% demographic. By combining a credible threat of overwhelming law enforcement with immediate, unconditional access to social services, cities routinely see 30 to 40% drops in shootings. But when prevention fails, the math of a mass casualty event is grim. Uncontrolled hemorrhage is the leading preventable cause of death in trauma situations. Victims can bleed to death in 5 to 10 minutes, often long before paramedics can secure and enter an active scene. To counter this, local governments must mandate stop-the-bleed infrastructure, placing combat-grade tourniquets and hemostatic gauze in public hubs. This physically transforms civilian bystanders into the true first responders. When incident prevention fails, a municipality's localized trauma survival routing and hemorrhage control systems stand as the final, definitive barrier against mortality. A critical component of evidence-based policy is recognizing when well-intentioned municipal safety measures are actually iatrogenic, meaning the treatment itself mathematically fuels higher crime rates. Aggressive zero-tolerance tactics like stop and frisk fail to meaningfully intercept serious crime. Instead, they deeply alienate marginalized communities. When residents stop trusting the police, they stop providing intelligence and testifying as witnesses, effectively blinding detectives and allowing violent offenders to operate with impunity. Civil gang injunctions operate similarly. These spatial restraining orders prohibit suspected gang members from gathering in designated zones. Network analysis reveals they actually thicken conflict. By disrupting established social hierarchies and forcing members to reorganize outside the zone, injunctions displace and multiply the rivalries. Over a longer timeline, macroeconomic data validates the Donahue and Levitt hypothesis. Restricting reproductive freedom acts as a delayed catalyst for massive surges in crime. Denying access to abortion forces the birth of cohorts into environments characterized by psychosocial instability and poverty, artificially engineering a demographic surge in high-risk youth 2 decades later. Performing the theater of toughness without empirical backing victimizes the community twice, once through the loss of public trust, and again by guaranteeing the continuation of violence. When we plot these strategies on our completed efficacy matrix, the contrast is stark. The high-performing interventions focus on structural environments and strict access limits, while punitive dragnets cluster near the bottom. We cannot arrest our way out of an epidemiological crisis. Crime reduction requires a systemic approach that manipulates the physical environment, buffers neurobiological stressors, and strictly regulates criminogenic spaces. By prioritizing empirical data over political theater, local governments can use their existing regulatory and environmental levers to systematically reduce the frequency and severity of urban violence.